Hey Twisters, so for today's video, I'm going to talk about Stanley Cup contention windows. So what that means is how long does a given team have to win a Stanley Cup with a certain core group of players before they get too old. I've got 20 teams in total. There are some teams that I intentionally left out, and I want to know your thoughts down in the comments below about this. I thought this was one of the more challenging topics to explore as it pertains to kind of predictions and analysis in general, so be sure to sound off down there. I think this is subjective, so I do invite your disagreements. That's perfectly fine because I am curious to get your input there. Now, I did leave a few teams off of this list because they haven't been in the playoff picture the last number of years, even though for some of them out there, the future could be very bright. So teams like New Jersey, teams like Anaheim, Detroit, Ottawa, they're going to be excellent throughout most of this decade, I would think. And when looking at these sort of playoff contenders or cup contenders, I also don't really factor in the performance of various prospects because we don't know exactly how they're going to fit in. This really does focus on the core of players on that team right now and for the foreseeable future as well. So I'm going to get started with teams in the Eastern Conference from kind of like least likely to contend to most likely contend for a number of years. And I'm going to start with one team that wasn't part of the playoff picture this past year, but they could maybe crack the window back open, and that is the New York Islanders. Going into last year, I predicted them to win the Stanley Cup. I just feel like a complete idiot. But right now, I just don't think they have enough firepower up front. I think that maybe they would be one big move away from possibly getting that window to crack back open again. Certainly, they are built to succeed on defense and in goal for a number of years. Of course, Pelech and Pollock. You saw Noah Dobson break out last year. You saw Sorokin. And they're going to be on the roster at least for the next couple of years. Matt Barzal is a restricted free agent in 2023. And the Islanders, they won't be in such a cap crunch this next year because they do have a lot of players locked up a little bit longer term. But a couple of those deals could bite them in the butt as those deals mature. So right now, I'm not really feeling it so much with the Islanders as a cup contender. Maybe they could get back in the playoff picture. Now let's talk about this team here. That's the Boston Bruins. So I think that this year would have to be their year. And I think that we were saying that last year as well. Bergeron and Krejci were brought back in the offseason. So I think that helps, especially for a team that otherwise would be very thin at center. Even though those players are aging, they're still able to perform pretty well. So looking at this core of players, Marchand is still a fantastic player. And I don't know exactly when he'll tail off, but eventually that's going to happen, right? He's 34 years old. David Pastrnak, he's an unrestricted free agent at the end of this year, and the cap situation for the Bruins could be kind of tight, considering that Pasternak's going to demand a raise. He's making just over $6 million right now annually. But you still have good defensive assets out there like Charlie McAvoy and Hampus Lindholm for the foreseeable future. So if they're able to get that next center, that next Bergeron essentially, then yeah, this team could still be in the playoff picture for a couple of years. I just don't know if they're going to be quite at that level of a Stanley Cup contender. Now let's talk about the Washington Capitals. They haven't won a playoff series the last 4 years, even though they won a Stanley Cup just before that. You look at the core right now, you've got Alex Ovechkin, Evgeny Kuznetsov, John Carlson, Dmitry Orlov, Nicholas Backstrom, and TJ Oshie as well. Backstrom, we don't even know if he's going to play this season or beyond that. And so, yeah, they are aging a little bit, and they're still able to get it done. They could still certainly be a playoff team this upcoming season. And the cap situation, those deals do actually extend even longer term than you would think. Orlov is an unrestricted free agent in 2023, and you got Mantha, his contract is up in 2024. So a lot of that core is going to still stick around. But some of those depth pieces are going to fall out, guys like Lars Eller or Garnet Hathaway. And again, without Backstrom, the center depth starts to look kind of thin. You have to expect more from Dylan Strome. So looking at the Capitals, I would be surprised if they could get maybe, 2 series wins under their belt in a given playoff season within the next 2 years. Now we get to a team that might kind of surprise you here as I talk about them. That's the Carolina Hurricanes. I almost have to think that this year has to be their year. A couple reasons. Freddie Anderson is going to be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season, although his numbers I do attribute to that excellent Carolina defense, and it should be good for at least 2 more years. But they brought in Max Pacioretty, somewhat to fill the void left by Vincent Trocheck in terms of productivity from the top 6. I don't know. I think that the forward group, kind of like the Islanders, is missing one other player, especially as you look at the injury to Pacioretty. When I look at players like Seth Jarvis, certainly he is trending in an upward direction. But then, Natchez took a step backward this past season, and you also have Kotkaniemi. You're not entirely sure what you're going to get out of him. And I think that, that's kind of part of the missing equation for a team that performed incredibly well the past 2 regular seasons, but hasn't made that deep run since 2019 when they went to the conference finals. So I would hope that, with Burns coming in to play with Slavin and also Pacioretty toward the end of the season, maybe that could, get this team over the hump. But beyond that, I'm not entirely sure with them. They might have to retool after this year. Now we get to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they kept a lot of players together over this past season. So I'm going to say that they have about a 2-year window to win a Stanley Cup with this core. So the core being Crosby, Gensel, Malkin, Letang, and Jari. This is interesting because you have a few players in their mid-30s who are still putting up incredible numbers, but things are going to get a little bit more interesting for a team that has a lot of money tied up with players like Malkin, like Ricard Raquel. You also have Jeff Petrie making over $6 million as well. So a couple of bad contracts, I would think, for the Penguins if they want to make room for a sizable extension for a goaltender like Tristan Jarry, who was excellent for them this past season and is going into the prime of his career. And then the year after that, you have Jake Gensel. I would think that he would get a big pay raise as well. I think that Jason Zucker coming off the books next year will definitely help the Pens. But beyond that, I'm not sure if they can really expect the same players 2 years from now to be carrying the load for this team. Next team are the Maple Leafs. I say a 2-year window for them. One huge reason is because you look at 2024, Austin Matthews and Willie Nylander will be unrestricted free agents. But even so with the Maple Leafs, no playoff series wins with this core whatsoever, even before the past 3 years. And I just don't think that, Kyle Dubas or Sheldon Keefe are going to be around much more if they can't make progress in the postseason as good as they are in the regular season. So this team still isn't built for postseason success. And so eventually, will we see players like Matthews or Nylander wanting to go somewhere else to have a shot at winning a Stanley Cup in the primes of their careers especially? So that's why I think Toronto, 2 years, and then a pretty serious reeval. And now for a couple of teams who I think have a larger Stanley Cup window. First of all, it's the Florida Panthers, right? 1 playoff series win since 1996. I know that, but they did get one this past season, and I know that it was a huge season a huge offseason for transactions. I'm going to say about 3 years for the Florida Panthers. I think they take a step back this season, but considering their core, right? Barkov, 26 years old. I think he's about to turn 27. Matthew Tkachuk, 24. Sam Reinhart, who was over a point per game this last year, is 26. Aaron Ekblad is still only 26 years old. So you've got some prime years for these players. You've got prime years for like Anthony Duclair. I know he's going to be out for a while. And you also have Carter Verhaeghe, who's coming off an excellent year as well. Going beyond 2024, it will be a little tricky for them. You'll have a couple of UFAs, including Sam Reinhart, including Gustav Forsling, maybe their best defender on the team, Anthony Duclair as well. And when you consider that as well, Bobrovsky will also be 35 years old. And Spencer Knight, he hasn't exactly, over a longer period of time proven that he's the franchise goaltender going forward. So I think there are big question marks. But looking at Florida, I think one thing that will definitely be an advantage for them is their center depth going forward. Barkov's locked up long-term. Bennett's there, I think, for 3 more years. And you also have Anton Lundell. And I think that the proof point is definitely there for him. He's going to be at least an excellent middle 6 center in the NHL. So I still think that they could be very competitive, especially with some of these prime years for like Tkachuk not even being reached just yet. Now we get to the Tampa Bay Lightning, and I think I was almost kind of generous with them. I gave them a 3-year window, and I did talk about this very much in depth in a separate video. I'll put it up here if you want to watch it. So with Tampa, one thing that kind of concerns me is their goal scoring abilities going forward. Maybe not so much this year. You've got one more year of Alex Killorn coming off a great season, but in the postseason, he was stone cold. He's getting a little bit older as well. Stamkos, a fantastic season, but he's also starting to get a little bit older. You still have prime Kucherov, prime Braden Point, which is excellent, but a little bit further down the lineup, when I look at this team 2 or 3 years from now, in terms of goal scoring from kind of the second line position, I don't know who's going to be getting it done for them necessarily. You still, of course, have excellent defensive players. Victor Hedman on defense. You also have Anthony Cirelli, who's an elite defensive forward. Eric Chernak was extended long-term in the offseason. And you have Andrei Vasilevsky. So, I mean, this team is still going to be making the playoffs, I would think, in a 3-year period here. But again, I don't know if they exactly have enough firepower to kind of complement that. And lastly, in the Eastern Conference, the team that I think has the biggest Stanley Cup contention window are the New York Rangers. And to me, they're very much ahead of schedule. I think this window could be at least 4 years long. The reason why I say that is because you have a great core leading the way right now with Panarin, Zibanejad, Kreider, Fox, who's only 24 years old, and Igor Shesterkin. But behind them, you already have some great young players in the likes of Alexis Lafreniere, Philip Hedl, and Kaapo Kakko. They still have some development ahead of them. But from what we saw in the playoffs, from the opportunities they got, they could possibly take over for this team when some of those older forwards get a little bit longer in the tooth. You also have Lindgren on defense. You have Miller on defense. You have prime years from Vincent Trocheck and Barclay Goodrow as well. But the way this team has been built over the last few years, including this offseason, I think the Rangers are going to be the team in the Eastern Conference for a number of years. I think they could at least advance to the Stanley Cup final twice or three times in the next 5 years. And even though some of these players will be restricted free agents, guys like Keandre Miller and Lafreniere, you don't have any big UFA contracts coming up until 2025 with Igor Shesterkin. So he'll get absolutely paid then, and then things might start to turn over a little bit for the Rangers. But even so, with some of that youth, this team is set up for success in the long term, absolutely. All right, now we go to the Western Conference, and I have 11 teams here total. I don't think there are that many true contenders, so I will go over some of these a little bit more quickly. We'll start with a couple teams who didn't make the playoffs this past year. First of all, the Winnipeg Jets. I mean, this team was so close to getting to the Stanley Cup final, it seemed, a few years ago. Even 2 years ago, they made a nice little run there. I think that right now, they should be in a retool. They didn't really do that in the offseason, but this team is going to be driven by Kyle Connor, and if he's healthy, Nikolai Ehlers. I think of them as the two most crucial pieces in terms of the forwards, and they have some great young centers as well in their prospect pool. But again, we don't know exactly what we're going to get out of them in the next couple of seasons. So really with the Jets, I think it's a missed opportunity for them to open the window, 3 or 4 years from now, honestly. One big checkpoint for them will be 2024. That's when Blake Wheeler's contract is up, and same thing for Mark Scheifele. So again, if they have what they need from the young centers, then they could possibly move on from Scheifele then. The Jets, they're still a fairly competitive team, especially if Connor Hellebuck is on and isn't injured or being driven into the ground with how many games he's playing. But I just don't see it with them right now. It could crack open again in 3 years. Now for the Vancouver Canucks, another team that has been out of the playoff picture the past couple of seasons actually, but they played remarkably well under Bruce Boudreau when he was the interim coach this past season. And also you have to remember that in 2020, they were a Game 7 away from going to the Western Conference Final. And one little note here, guys, when I say playoff series wins, I do not count that first round, the qualifying round, because that was a best-of-5 series, and some of the competition weren't even playoff teams by traditional qualification means. So that's just a little note there. So with the Canucks, I think that they could crack it open this year. A lot of things have to go right. Brock Besser and maybe even Pettersson have kind of bounce backs this season. And also Thatcher Demko. Just if he continues to play really well, I think they could be a playoff team. I think they could secure a wild card or maybe even finish third in the Pacific Division. I'm not going to commit to that right now, too. And one other team who missed the playoffs this last year from the West are the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, I think that without Robin Lehner, I just don't see them being a Stanley Cup contender this year. Could they get back into the playoffs? Yeah, in the Pacific Division, I think that's totally fine. But I think that for the Knights, they have to do it in the next 2 years. I think that's when the window really closes in on them. So you have some prime years still from Mark Stone and Jonathan Marchessault, who's been wonderful for them. He's going to be a UFA in 2024, by the way, so I do think that's a factor. Robin Lehner, maybe he'll be back, for 2 seasons from now, and he'll be able to play very well for Vegas. They still have good, defensive assets as well, in the likes of Theodore, Martinez, and Pietrangelo too. But some of these players are getting a little bit older for Vegas, especially when I talk about that checkpoint 2 years from now. 2024, Marchessault, Stevenson, and also Alec Martinez are unrestricted free agents. So I think that for Vegas, they're rolling the dice with this team. It's got to be in the next 2 years. I just realized I didn't write any notes for this team. I don't mean to keep forgetting them in my videos. That's the LA Kings. This is a really interesting team, kind of like the Rangers in that they are ahead of schedule. They made the playoffs. They finished third in the division this past season, and they also landed Kevin Fiala. They kept Adrian Kempe as well. But I don't know if they've exactly opened the Stanley Cup window. Maybe they have, with Fiala, with Danault, centering that second line, of course, Kopitar on the top line, with Adrian Kempe, and Drew Doughty. If he's healthy, this team could actually be pretty deadly. I do question the goaltending a little bit with the likes of Jonathan Quick and Cal Peterson. Peterson is extended through 2025. Quick is going to be a UFA after next season, and so maybe that will be a turning point for them. So that is one little question mark there, but they do have a lot of younger players as well, guys like Kaliev and Byfield and Turcotte, who will eventually crack this window wide open, I would think, for the Kings. But overall, I kind of like what I'm seeing from LA. They should certainly compete for a playoff spot this season, and in the offseason, I mean, their biggest free agent here, it looks like, is going to be Trevor Moore. And then the following year, you've got Kopitar. I think he would take a discount to stay on the team. Victor Arvidsson, he's contributed, but I don't think he's necessarily essential for this team going forward with the young talent that they have. So for LA, if right now it's cracked open, it's going to be wide open, I would think, 2 or 3 years from now. These other 8 teams all made the playoffs this past season. This one's interesting. They had a fantastic year last year, but I do expect them to regress, and that's the Minnesota Wild. One huge reason was losing Kevin Fiala to the LA Kings. And yeah, the Zach Parise and Ryan Suter buyouts are definitely biting this team in the butt. However, with Minnesota, although I don't really see the window open for this year or maybe for next year, I think like looking at 2024-25, that's when we see it open back up because the Wild do have a crazy good prospect pool. And you also have to consider there are players like Kaprizov who will still be in his prime. Matt Boldy, he's only going to keep getting better as well. So I think the opportunity for Minnesota is in the future to compete with teams like Anaheim, to compete against teams like New Jersey, right? So that's kind of where I have them. Looking at their cap situation in 2023, Frederick Gaudreau will be a UFA. He did have a breakout season this past year, in part because he played with Fiala. Matt Dumba will also be a UFA. And then in 2024, it's a big year. It's a real big year for them. Zuccarello, Foligno, and Ryan Hartman, who was a monster this past season for Minnesota, playing with Kaprizov, and also Marc-Andre Fleury. So big decisions ahead for Bill Guerin. Again, I think that maybe there's a chance that in that competitive Central, maybe the Wild actually miss the playoffs this upcoming season, but they're going to come back with a vengeance later in this decade, in my opinion. Now for the Dallas Stars, and I think that this year has to be their year. Really. They've got some bad contracts on that team with Sagan and Ben, and of course, those are only going to age more poorly. Joe Pavelski's back. He is 38 years old, but he could still perform for them very well for another year or two. But it was kind of hard gauging Dallas because, first of all, Jason Robertson and Jake Ottinger haven't even been signed. But assuming that they are signed, I still think that this team is lacking in a couple of roles. And then when you look at 2023, Pavelski will be a UFA. Robe Hintz is an RFA, and he's going to get absolutely paid by the club, or at least he'll demand that, especially based on what we see here with Jason Robertson. And then when you consider those anchors of contracts for the likes of Ben and Sagan, yeah, it might actually be difficult to make way for other important depth pieces. And that's one thing that the Stars have lacked over the past couple of years, as good as their defense and goaltending can be. Another team who I think needs to get it done this year are the St. Louis Blues. I was a little bit surprised when I made that sort of projection. A lot of their players right now, their prime performers, are in their later 20s or in their early 30s. So that's good for the next couple of seasons. But a cup contender, I'm not entirely sure about that. One reason is because we're not entirely sure what we're going to get out of Jordan Binnington. Do we get playoff Binnington or do we get regular season Binnington from last year? And another big factor for this team is the 2023 offseason. So look at these contracts, right? Ryan O'Reilly is a UFA. Vlad Tarasenko, who had 82 points this past season, is a UFA. Ivan Barbashev, who's making like $2.5 million and scored, I think, like around 60 points. He's a UFA. And Jordan Kyrou is an RFA. And you think of Robert Thomas, he got a big extension. I would not think that Kyrou would receive something different from that. So I think that they're going to be in a bit of a cap crunch here. They have to make some big decisions, especially if they want to, for example, upgrade their goaltending situation. What if Binnington isn't the guy for the future? Then they got to pay for somebody else because Greiss is going to be up after, I think, this upcoming season. So with St. Louis, as much as I like the way that the roster is built, even on the backside with somebody like Torrey Krug and Justin Falk and Scott Perunovich, hopefully in the wings, I just don't know if they're going to be that formidable of an opponent after this next season. Now for the Nashville Predators, I don't see this team as a cup contender. I like the way that their roster is built. I think that they could still be a playoff team the next couple of seasons. I think that if they're going to challenge for a Stanley Cup, it has to happen within the next 2 years. You have a couple more prime seasons out of Matt Duchene, Ryan Johansson, Mikhail Granlund. These guys had, career seasons, or at least they had good career resurgences. Roman Yossi's 32 years old. He had 96 points this past season. And you also have Ryan McDonough brought in from Tampa and Matthias Ekholm. They're getting a little bit older, but they're still able to play their role pretty well. But they're going to be in a tight cap situation. And some of those young players on their team are going to get extensions in the next couple of seasons. Guys like Tanner Jeannot, he's going to be an RFA at the end of this next year. And I think that he's going to be a franchise player going forward. Dante Fabro as well on defense. And then 2024, you have like Yakov Trenin, Eli Tolvanen, Philip Tomasino, who had kind of a breakout season this past year as well. I would think that they would want some pretty fat deals, considering at that point they could be up around 45, 50 points a season. And so when you have some of that money tied up long-term for guys like Forsberg, Johansson, Duchesne, right? And they start to regress 2 or 3 seasons from now significantly, then yeah, things could start to get a little dicey for the Nashville Predators, even if you say Saros is still in the prime of his career as well. I've got 3 more teams here. First of all, the Calgary Flames. This one was interesting because they made quite a few splashes this offseason, and they did lose a couple of huge names as well. I say that their cup window is 2 years. I'm confident saying 2 years for them. So you've got prime Elias Lindholm, prime Jonathan Huberdeau, Nazem Kadri, Mackenzie Weegar for this next season. We'll see about an extension. Jacob Markstrom still able to perform very well, albeit not so well in the playoffs this past year. So yeah, Mackenzie Weegar is the big free agent in 2023, but Brad Treliving did a tremendous job with some of these extensions in this past offseason. 2024, though, this is where it gets difficult, right? These are just some of the players who are up for contracts. Elias Lindholm, he's going to get paid, absolutely. He's not even making $5 million, I don't think. Mikhail Backlund, Tyler Toffoli, Noah Hannafin, Chris Tanev, and many others as well. So even though I love Jonathan Huberdeau, he's getting paid quite a bit. Nazem Kadri, his deal will be good for at least a few years as well. But beyond that, I'm not entirely sure just exactly how intact this core can be. Now we get to the Edmonton Oilers, and they have McDavid and Draisaitl locked up long-term. I think this window could extend for 3 or 4 years. I think that when you look at some of the pieces around them, like Evander Kane, we'll see how the deal matures, but he was a great contributor for them this last year. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Zach Hyman are great pieces for this club as well. And they also have Jack Campbell, who isn't the best goaltender out there, but as a 1A, he's excellent. If Stuart Skinner can be a good backup for him, I think that the Oilers could be fine in net. Now let's look at the free agency situation. So in 2023, you've got Jesse Puljujärvi. He's an RFA. But the roster overall should be very similar. 2024, Evan Bouchard will be an RFA, and he's pretty young, so he could take a bridge deal, even though I think he's going to be a star for this team. Tyson Barrie, his contract will be up, and I think they'll probably want to move off of that. And also you have Kyler Yamamoto as an RFA. But I think that the core of this team being intact with players like Nurse and also, Bouchard on defense, Kulak. I think that was a smart extension. Campbell and net, Skinner having a promising kind of first 13 games with the club this last year. I think things could look pretty promising for the Oilers, especially if the division is still taking a while to churn with teams like Anaheim and LA potentially getting better. And the last team I'll talk about here are the Colorado Avalanche. Now, I said 3 or 4 years for the Oilers. I don't know if I would exactly go beyond 2 years, if not 3 for the Avalanche. There are a couple of big factors for this team going forward, even though, of course, Joe Sakic and now Chris McFarland are doing a wonderful, wonderful job. So let's take a look at the Avs here. Their biggest loss in the offseason was Nazem Kadri. So that does leave a void, I think, at the second line center. JT Compher could possibly play that this upcoming season. I've also heard that maybe Alex Newhook could be that player going forward as well. But that does look like a point of weakness on a team that has very few of them, right? You have Arturi Lehkonen, you have Val Nichushkin moving into the top 6 on this team, and they were magnificent this past season, especially in the postseason. So that's not really a concern for me. But the 2C stands out, and also 2023 in the offseason, Nathan MacKinnon is due for a pretty big pay raise. He's been making only $6.3 million annually. I think he's going to be at least at 10.5. Mikko Rantanen is at 9.5. And then you also have Bowen Byram as a restricted free agent. He's still going to be very young. Could he take a bridge deal? I would think so, especially as he takes on more of a role with this club. And I especially say that looking at 2024 when Devon Toews is an unrestricted free agent. He was 8th in Norris Trophy voting this past season. And that's not just because of Makar. Devon Toews is a fantastic two-way defenseman. So will they have room for him and Byram, considering the McKinnon extension as well? I'm not entirely sure, because Toews is a guy who, even at 30 years old in 2024, I think he could make $6 or $7 million easily, assuming that he plays this way for the next 2 seasons. So I'm not entirely sure if they'll be able to keep everybody together, but they should still be a terrific team, a playoff caliber team for at least 3 to 5 years from now, I would say. Anyway, guys, those are my projections for Stanley Cup windows. What do you think? And you could even comment down below with teams who you think will have a wide open window in the foreseeable future, guys like the Red Wings and the Senators and the Devils and the Ducks, absolutely. If I were to talk about a team who has the most potential to dominate this decade that we haven't talked about in this video, it would be the Ducks. Anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and stick around for more content like this throughout the rest of the offseason. We're getting into September now, or actually we are in September. I'm just making this on the 31st. And so I'll have all sorts of previews and predictions, division breakdowns. That's going to be a big one. So I hope you're looking forward to the content in the foreseeable future. And if you are, make sure you hit the thumbs up, hit the notifications bell, so that way you know when I upload content. And you can also follow me on social media. Just see the video description down below. There's also info there if you want to contribute with a donation. I also accept super thanks. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in, Twisters. I'm Nick, and I'll catch you later. Ciao.